The children's laughter hit Elsie like a slap before she even reached the schoolyard gate. Nobody wanted your mama. A boy named Cray Dutton, son of the wealthiest merchant on Main Street, cupped his hands around his mouth so the whole yard could hear. That's why there's no daddy. Nobody wanted her. Elsie stood frozen in the dirt, her lunch pail hanging from one hand, her knuckles going white around the handle. 8 years old, small for her age, and every child in that yard was looking at her like she was something someone had dropped and forgotten to pick up. She didn't cry. Not yet. She saved that for later, when she was running. Amen. If you've ever watched a child try to hold herself together while the world came apart around her, you already know what kind of story this is. If you've ever been that child, you know it even better. Stay with us until the end, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss what happens next, and hit that like button right now. Drop your city and country in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels, because what one man does next will change everything for a woman who had stopped believing anyone ever would. Well, Naomi Ashford had lived in Red Hollow for 4 years, and in 4 years she had learned exactly one thing about the town. It had a long memory and a short supply of mercy. She hadn't come here by choice, exactly. She'd come here because her husband, Thomas, had signed a lease on a shop front 6 weeks before he died of fever on the trail, and she'd arrived with an 8-year-old daughter, 2 trunks of dry goods, and a Singer sewing machine that had belonged to her mother. There was nowhere else to go. The shop was paid. The machine still worked. So she stayed. She built a seamstress business the only way she knew how, stitch by stitch, customer by customer, arriving before sunrise and leaving after dark. She took in mending for ranch hands who couldn't afford better. She let Mrs. Alcott, the schoolteacher's wife, pay in eggs when her husband's salary ran short. She altered dresses for the Drummond sisters at half price because they were the only 2 women in town who spoke to her without looking over their shoulder first. People used her work. They respected her hands, even when they didn't respect her face. That was enough. Or she'd told herself it was enough. For 4 years she had told herself that. Elsie was the thing that made it complicated. Elsie was bright and quick and had her father's way of asking questions that made adults uncomfortable. Not because the questions were rude, but because they were exactly right. She'd started school the autumn after they arrived in Red Hollow, and for the first year it had been manageable. Children at that age don't always notice the things adults train them to notice. But they learn. They watch their parents' faces at the supper table. They hear the things said in low voices after they're supposed to be asleep. By 2nd grade, Cray Dutton had started. Cray was the kind of child who had learned early that humiliation was a form of power, and that the safest person to practice on was someone who had no one standing behind them. He'd chosen Elsie with the precision of a boy who already understood, at 9 years old, how the world sorted people. She had no father. Her mother was the woman who fixed other people's clothes. They lived in 2 rooms behind the shop. He'd started small, comments about her dress, questions about her lunch. Then he'd gotten bolder, because no one stopped him, and the other children had started to follow his lead the way children follow any current that looks strong enough to carry them somewhere. By the spring of her 3rd year, Elsie had stopped telling Naomi what happened at school. Naomi knew anyway. A mother always knows. She saw it in the way Elsie went quiet on Sunday evenings, knowing Monday was coming. She saw it in the careful way her daughter laid out her school dress the night before, pressing it flat with her small hands as if the right creases might protect her from something. She saw it in the way Elsie had stopped mentioning anyone by name. No friends, no stories, just careful silence where a child's chatter should have been. Naomi had gone to the schoolmaster twice. Mr. Fenn was a thin, tired man who believed that children sorted out their own difficulties if left alone long enough, and who had a particular habit of looking slightly past whoever he was speaking to rather than directly at them. He'd listened to her with the expression of a man waiting for rain to stop. He'd said he'd speak to the children. Whatever he said had not changed anything. She hadn't gone back a 3rd time. She understood that some doors, once you saw what was on the other side, weren't worth knocking on again. That Tuesday afternoon in April, Naomi was at her workbench hemming a skirt for Margaret Pryor when she heard the running footsteps on the boardwalk outside. She knew them before the door opened. She knew her daughter's footfall the way she knew the sound of her own breathing. Elsie came through the door at a dead run and buried her face in Naomi's side without a word, and her whole body shook with the force of crying she'd been holding back since the schoolyard. Naomi put down her needle. She didn't say anything. She just wrapped both arms around the child and held on and waited. It took a long time. When the shaking finally slowed, Elsie pulled back enough to look up at her mother. Her face was a wreck, red and swollen, her braids coming undone on one side, a smear of dust across her cheek from where she'd wiped it with the back of her hand. "I don't want to go back," she said. Her voice was flat in the way voices go flat when someone has moved past, crying into something harder. "Mama, I'm not going back." Naomi smoothed the loose braid back behind her daughter's ear. "Tell me what happened. You know what happened. Tell me anyway." Elsie's jaw tightened. That was Thomas in her, that jaw. "Cray said nobody wanted you. He said it in front of everyone. He said it loud so the girls on the other side of the yard could hear." She stopped, swallowed. "And Mrs. Fenn was standing right there, by the fence. She heard it too." Naomi's hands went still. "She didn't say anything?" she asked. Elsie shook her head. Naomi kept her face still. She'd had 4 years of practice keeping her face still. And the other children? They laughed. Elsie pulled away and sat down on the footstool by the window, and she looked suddenly very tired, the way children look when they've used up everything they had. "I don't have a name to stand behind, Mama. That's what Cray said. He said our name doesn't count for anything because there's no man left in it." The room was quiet, except for the sound of wind against the shop window, and somewhere down the street a horse stamping and the distant knock of a hammer from the new building going up behind the feed store. Naomi looked at her daughter. 8 years old. 8 years old and already being taught by a town full of grown people that she was worth less because of the shape of her family. Being taught it by a 9-year-old boy, yes, but 9-year-old boys don't invent those ideas. They inherit them. "You have a name," Naomi said. "Ashford doesn't protect us, Mama." Elsie looked out the window. "Cray's father is friends with Mr. Fenn. That's why nobody stops him. That's why Mrs. Fenn didn't say anything." She turned back. "You know that's true." Naomi didn't answer because Elsie was right, and they both knew it, and lying to a child who has already figured out the truth is one of the cruelest things an adult can do. She knelt in front of the footstool instead. She took both of her daughter's hands in hers, and she felt the roughness of her own palms against Elsie's small fingers and thought, not for the first time, about how different those hands were from anything she'd imagined for herself when she was young. "Listen to me," she said. Elsie looked at her. "You are going back to school. Not because it's fair. It isn't fair. You are going back because letting Cray Dutton run you out of that schoolyard is the last thing I will ever allow to happen to you. And you are smarter than he will ever be. And someday that is going to matter more than his father's friendships." She squeezed her daughter's hands once, hard. "But not today. Today you stay here with me." Elsie nodded slowly. It wasn't belief exactly. It was the fragile compliance of a child who didn't have anywhere else to put her trust. Naomi stood. She went back to her workbench and picked up her needle, and she worked for the next 3 hours without stopping, because stopping would have meant sitting with what she felt, and she couldn't afford to do that. She didn't see who was watching from across the street. Colton Briggs had not intended to stop in front of Ashford's seamstress that afternoon. He'd been on his way to the bank, an errand he'd been putting off for 2 weeks because it involved a conversation with Harold Pryor that he didn't want to have, about a boundary survey that Pryor had commissioned without consulting him, on land that was adjacent to the western edge of the Briggs Ranch. He had the survey report in his coat pocket and a specific idea of what he was going to say, and he'd been composing that conversation in his head for the better part of the walk from where he'd tied his horse. Then he'd heard the running footsteps. He turned without thinking, an old reflex, the kind that comes from years of watching everything on a working ranch, where a sound out of place usually means something is wrong. He'd seen the little girl hit the door of the seamstress shop at full speed, her braids flying, and something about the way she ran, the desperate particular way of it, had made him stop. He stood there on the opposite boardwalk for longer than he'd meant to. He knew who they were. Red Hollow was not a large town, and a woman running a seamstress shop alone with a child was the kind of situation a town noticed and had opinions about. He'd heard the opinions. Margaret Pryor had aired several of them in his presence at her husband's dinner table last fall, and that particular tone some women used for discussing people they considered unfortunate, sympathetic on the surface, and something else entirely underneath. He didn't know Naomi Ashford personally. He'd seen her in the street. He'd seen the child. He had the vague, general impression of a woman who worked hard and kept to herself and didn't ask anything of anyone, which were qualities he respected without having thought much about them one way or another. He stood there looking at the closed door of the seamstress shop, and then he looked at the people who were not looking at it, the women on the far corner who had watched the child run past and then gone back to their conversation, the man coming out of the hardware store who had glanced up and looked away, the two older boys sitting on the steps of the dry goods store who were laughing about something. He put the survey report back in his inside pocket and walked across the street. He wasn't sure why exactly. He had no particular plan. He'd pulled back from most things that didn't belong directly to him since Margaret died 5 years ago. Pulled back quietly and systematically, the way a man hauls in a boat from rough water and ties it up and doesn't put it out again. The ranch was enough. The work was enough. He had hands to manage and cattle to move and fences to maintain, and that was a complete life, or he'd convinced himself it was. But he stood on the boardwalk in front of the seamstress shop and looked at the closed door and thought about that child's face in the moment before she disappeared through it, and something in his chest did something he hadn't felt in long enough that he'd almost forgotten what it was. He knocked. The woman who answered looked like she'd been expecting a bill collector and got something she couldn't identify. She was maybe 32, 33. Brown hair pulled straight back and pinned efficiently. A sewing needle threaded and held between two fingers, as though she'd grabbed it before she'd thought to put it down. Her eyes were steady and carefully neutral in the way of a person who has learned not to show anything to anyone until they know what they're dealing with. "Mr. Briggs," she said. She knew who he was. Of course she did. "Mrs. Ashford." He took his hat off. "I saw your daughter come home. I wanted to make sure—" He stopped because now that he was here, he had no prepared sentence. "I wanted to make sure everything was all right." She looked at him for a moment. Something moved behind those careful eyes. "Everything is fine," she said. "Thank you." He nodded. He should have turned around. He recognized this moment, the ordinary moment where a person makes the ordinary choice and goes about their business. Instead, he said, "I was at the schoolyard this morning, early, when I was coming back from the land office." He paused. "I heard some of what those children were saying." Her face didn't change, but she went very still. "The Dutton boy," he said. "Yes," she said, "and Mrs. Fenn." She didn't say anything. He turned his hat over in his hands once. "I'm sorry," he said. "I should have stepped in this morning. I kept walking, and I've been thinking about that all day, and I'm sorry." She stared at him. He could see she hadn't expected that, hadn't expected any of this, really, and that she didn't quite know what to do with it. "You don't have any obligation to us," she said finally. "No," he agreed. "I don't." Another silence. Somewhere in the back of the shop, a child's voice said something, too low to make out the words. "Your daughter," Colton said. "What's her name?" Something in Naomi's expression shifted, just slightly, like a door that hadn't been latched properly. "Elsie," she said. He put his hat back on. "Good evening, Mrs. Ashford." He walked back across the street, and he kept walking, and he didn't let himself think too carefully about any of it until he was on his horse, and the lights of Red Hollow were behind him, and the only sound was wind across the prairie grass and the steady rhythm of hooves on dry ground. He thought about the little girl's face, the careful way she'd held herself together right up until the moment she didn't have to anymore. He thought about what it cost a person, young or old, to hold themselves together like that day after day in a place that had decided to make things hard for them. He thought about what he hadn't done that morning. He didn't sleep well that night. In the back of Naomi's shop, Elsie lay on her cot with her eyes open and listened to the quiet. She heard her mother working late, the soft pull of thread, the creak of the chair, the small, precise sounds of someone who had too much to do and too little time to do it, and no one to share the weight. She turned onto her side. She pressed her palm flat against the wall the way she sometimes did when she was little and afraid of something she couldn't name. The wall was cool and solid. It didn't move. She closed her eyes and tried to think of what her father's face had looked like. But lately she couldn't always get it right. The edges blurred. She could remember his voice better than his face, which seemed wrong, but there was nothing she could do about it. Nobody wanted your mama. She opened her eyes. The ceiling of the room was the same ceiling it always was. The shadows moved when the wind moved outside. Nothing had changed, and everything had changed, and she didn't have a word for the particular exhausted fury of being 8 years old and understanding that something was unfair and not being able to fix it. She heard her mother pull her chair back from the workbench. She heard the lamp turn down. She heard footsteps cross the floor and stop outside her door. There was a pause. Then her mother's voice, quiet, through the door. "I know you're not asleep." "I'm thinking," Elsie said. "Think quieter." But there was no sharpness in it. A longer pause. "Mama," Elsie said. "Hmm? Do you think it ever gets better?" The silence that followed was the kind that meant her mother was taking the question seriously, which Naomi always did, which was the one thing that made Elsie trust her more than anyone. "Yes," Naomi said. "Not always the way you imagine it. But yes." Elsie was quiet for a moment. "Okay," she said. She heard her mother's footsteps move away. She heard the door of the other room close softly. Outside, down the dark street, a dog barked twice and then went quiet. The wind pressed against the window and let go. Red Hollow settled into the particular heavy silence of a small town that thought it knew everything about everyone within its borders. It didn't know yet what was coming. He didn't go to the bank the next morning. He told himself he was going to. He got up before light the way he always did, dressed, drank his coffee, standing at the kitchen window, while the sky went from black to the particular dark blue that comes just before dawn breaks. And he thought about Harold Pryor and the boundary survey and the conversation he still needed to have. He thought about his foreman, Dale Sutter, waiting on his decision about moving the south herd before the grass got too dry. He thought about the fence line along the creek that needed 3 new posts before the week was out. He saddled his horse and rode toward town. He went past the bank without stopping. He told himself he was just riding. A man could ride through his own town without a specific reason. He'd done it 100 times. Red Hollow in the early morning had a quality he'd always liked. The quiet before the commerce started, the way the light came low and flat across the rooftops, the smell of wood smoke and bread from the bakers on 2nd Street. He rode slowly, and he didn't examine too carefully where he was going until he found himself at the far end of Main Street near the schoolyard at roughly the same time children began arriving for the morning. He stopped his horse at the corner and watched from a distance. Elsie Ashford came up the street alone, the way she apparently always did. She walked with her chin up in the particular way of someone who has decided not to let anything show, and she was wearing a blue dress that had been carefully pressed and her braids were neat and straight. She looked like someone who had gotten up that morning and made deliberate choices about how she would face what was coming. He watched her go through the schoolyard gate. He watched Cray Dutton spot her from across the yard and lean over to say something to the 2 boys beside him, and the way all 3 of them laughed. Elsie kept walking. She didn't look at them. She went to the far corner of the yard and sat down on the bench there, opened her reader, and stared at it with the focused attention of someone who has decided that a book is the safest place to be. Colton sat on his horse and watched, and felt something turning over slowly in his chest, something with weight to it. Then Cray's mother arrived. He hadn't expected that. Clara Dutton didn't usually come to the schoolyard. She had a housekeeper for that kind of thing. But she came that morning with 2 other women he recognized as wives of men who ran businesses on Main Street, and the 3 of them stopped near the gate and stood together in the particular formation of women who have gathered for a specific purpose. He was too far away to hear what they were saying, but he could see their faces, and he could see when Clara Dutton looked across the yard toward Elsie and said something to her companions, and he could see the way all 3 of them laughed. Not the polite, tucked-away laughter of women pretending to be discreet. The open kind. The kind that carries. Elsie's head came up from her book. She'd heard it. She looked at the women, and then she looked back down at the page, and Colton watched her press her lips together in the tight, precise way of a child trying very hard not to cry in a place where crying would make everything worse. He dismounted, tied his horse to the post, and walked into the schoolyard. He didn't have a plan. He'd been a man without plans for most of the past 5 years, moving from one necessary task to the next, which had worked well enough for running a ranch, and worked considerably less well for everything else. He walked across the yard and the children noticed him before the women did. Children always notice when an adult enters their space at an unexpected time. And the yard went a little quieter in that ripple of attention way of places where people are watching to see what happens. He walked to the bench in the corner. Elsie looked up when he stopped in front of her. Her expression went through about 4 things in quick succession: surprise, wariness, confusion, and then something careful and still that was probably the closest she came to neutral when she didn't know what was happening. "Good morning," he said. She looked at him. "Good morning, Mr. Briggs." He was mildly surprised she knew his name. He shouldn't have been. Her mother would have told her, after last night. He crouched down so he wasn't standing over her, which seemed more appropriate for talking to a child, though he was aware he had no particular experience with children and might be getting this entirely wrong. "That's a good reader," he said, nodding at the book. She glanced down at it. "It's the only one I have." "Did you read it yet?" "3 times. She said it without self-pity, just as a fact. "Mr. Fenn won't let me borrow from the school lending shelf because he says I don't return things on time. I returned the last one 4 days late because Mama was sick and I forgot." Colton looked at her steadily. "That seems like an unreasonable policy." Something shifted in her face. A small, surprised flicker. She hadn't expected him to just agree with her. "That's what I thought too," she said. Across the yard, Clara Dutton had noticed him. He could feel it without looking. He could feel the quality of the attention change, the way it always did when the women of Red Hollow realized Colton Briggs was somewhere nearby and doing something that hadn't been explained to them yet. "Mr. Briggs!" That was Clara's voice, carrying across the yard with the particular bright sharpness of a woman who has decided to find something amusing. "Goodness, don't tell me you've taken up tutoring." He stood and turned around slowly. Clara Dutton was a handsome woman who had learned early that her attractiveness was a form of social currency and spent it accordingly. She was smiling at him now, the wide public smile she wore when she wanted an audience to see her being gracious. "Mrs. Dutton," he said. "Good morning." "I didn't know you had an interest in the schoolyard." She glanced at Elsie with the quick, dismissive look of someone checking to make sure a piece of furniture is still where they left it. "Or in the children." "I'm not sure why I'd need one," he said pleasantly. She laughed lightly. "Of course not. We were just commenting. The children do form such unexpected attachments sometimes, don't they? I suppose when a family is, well..." She tilted her head slightly in Elsie's direction, a gesture that managed to contain an entire paragraph of implication without using a single specific word. "Some children do look for substitutes." The yard was very quiet now. The children had stopped pretending to do other things. Colton looked at Clara Dutton for a moment. He had known her for 12 years. He had sat at dinner tables with her and her husband. He had done business with Gerald Dutton and found him straightforward enough. He had watched Clara operate in the social geography of Red Hollow for over a decade and understood her perfectly, which was probably why he'd kept a consistent and careful distance. "I think," he said, "that Elsie Ashford is one of the more composed children I've encountered, considering." He paused just long enough. "And I think the example being set for her from some quarters could stand some improvement." Clara's smile stayed in place, but the warmth drained out of it completely, the way a fire goes from burning to just coals between 1 second and the next. "Well," she said, "isn't that interesting?" "It is," he agreed. He turned back to Elsie, who was looking up at him with an expression he couldn't entirely read, part astonishment, part the particular careful wariness of a child who had learned not to trust good things until they proved themselves over time. "You'll be all right this morning?" he asked. She considered the question seriously, the way she apparently considered everything. "Probably," she said. "Good enough," he said. He touched the brim of his hat and walked back across the yard, past Clara Dutton and her companions without looking at them, past Cray Dutton, who was standing very still and staring at him, through the gate and back to his horse. His hands were steady. His jaw was not, quite. He untied the horse, mounted, and rode toward the bank to have the conversation with Harold Pryor that he'd been putting off. And he thought the whole way there about how many mornings that child had sat alone on that bench with her book, and how many mornings people had stood at that gate and laughed. And he thought about Clara Dutton's face when she'd said the word substitutes, and he felt something in himself that had been sitting quiet for a very long time begin to move. The story was all over Red Hollow by noon. Colton Briggs had gone into the schoolyard and confronted Clara Dutton in front of her own son and half the town's children. That was the version most people heard first, though by the time it had made 2 full circuits of Main Street, it had acquired considerable additional detail. He'd threatened her, some people said, or he'd made a scene, or he'd told Clara directly that her boy was a bully, or he'd put his hand on the seamstress woman's shoulder right there in front of everyone. None of those things had happened, but accuracy had never been Red Hollow's primary concern when it came to a good story. Naomi heard it third hand from the baker's wife who came in for a button replacement and who told it with the particular breathless quality of a woman delivering news she thought the recipient would find either devastating or thrilling and wasn't sure which to hope for. Naomi kept her eyes on her work while she listened and said very little. After the baker's wife left, she sat for a moment with her needle in her hand and stared at the middle distance and tried to sort through what she felt, which was harder than it should have been. Colton Briggs owed her nothing. He had made that plain enough himself the night before. People in Red Hollow did not insert themselves into other people's difficulties as a general rule, and on the rare occasions when they did, it was usually because they wanted something in return, or because they wanted to be seen doing it, which was a different thing from actually helping. She didn't know which of those applied here. She didn't know if either of them did. She didn't know this man well enough to know anything about his reasons, and she had learned through hard experience that not knowing a man's reasons was a situation requiring patience and caution in roughly equal measure. She picked her needle back up and kept working. That evening, Elsie came home from school, and she still didn't say much, but there was something different in her face. Less of that careful, bracing quality, that tightening of the jaw that Naomi had gotten used to seeing every morning. Not relief, exactly. More like the expression of someone who has seen a thing they weren't expecting and hasn't figured out yet what to make of it. "I heard something happened at school," Naomi said, carefully neutral. "Mr. Briggs came," Elsie said. "I heard." Elsie sat down and pulled off her shoes and looked at them for a moment. "He talked to Mrs. Dutton," she said, "in front of everyone." "Was it helpful?" Naomi asked. Elsie thought about it. "Cray didn't say anything all day," she said. Then after a pause, "That's never happened before." Naomi nodded. She turned back to the stove. "Mama," Elsie said. "Why did he do it?" Naomi stirred the pot and thought about that and didn't have a good answer, which bothered her more than she wanted to admit. "I don't know," she said. Elsie was quiet for a moment. "Is he a good man?" "I don't know him well enough to say." "But you think so?" Naomi stopped stirring. She turned around and looked at her daughter, who was watching her with those Thomas eyes, the direct ones that had always made her feel like being seen more clearly than was always comfortable. "I think it was a decent thing to do," she said. "One decent thing doesn't tell you everything about a person." Elsie nodded, appearing to file this away somewhere. "Okay," she said, and went to wash her hands for supper. "Wait to it." Colton came by the shop 2 days later. He didn't make an event of it. He didn't bring anything or announce himself in advance. He simply appeared at the door at 4:30 in the afternoon, knocked twice, and when Naomi answered, he said he had a shirt with a collar that had started to separate, and he'd been meaning to get it seen to for a while. She took the shirt. She quoted him a price. He agreed to it without negotiating, which most men didn't. He came back 3 days after that with 2 more shirts and a coat with a torn lining. She took those too. They talked briefly about the work, what she'd do with each piece, when it would be ready, whether he wanted the lining replaced entirely or just mended. The conversation was completely ordinary, and also, she noticed, somewhat longer than it needed to be. She didn't say anything about that. On his 3rd visit, Elsie was in the shop doing her schoolwork at the side table, And when Colton came in, she looked up and studied him with the frank, slightly disconcerting attention she gave to most things she was trying to figure out. He looked back at her with equal directness. "You're doing arithmetic," he said. "Long division," she said. "It's terrible." "It is," he agreed. "It doesn't get better." She considered this. "That's not very encouraging." "No," he said. "I thought you might prefer the truth." Something in Elsie's face relaxed in a way Naomi had rarely seen it relax around anyone who wasn't her. It was small, that change, but Naomi caught it, and she tucked it away and thought about it later, after Colton had left and Elsie had gone to bed, sitting alone at her workbench in the quiet, with a coat that needed relining spread across her lap. She thought about the fact that her daughter had not once asked Colton Briggs why he'd come to the schoolyard. She'd asked Naomi, but not him, which meant either she didn't want to know or she'd already decided it didn't matter. Naomi wasn't sure which of those was more complicated. But what? The thing that changed everything happened on a Friday afternoon, when Naomi was on her way back from delivering a finished dress to the Alcott house and had to pass the corner of Main and 2nd, where a loose collection of people had gathered around something she couldn't see from half a block away. She heard the laughter first. It was the adult kind. Several voices, not one, mixing together in the way that meant whatever they were laughing at was considered safe to laugh at openly, in public, without lowering their voices. She slowed without meaning to, the way a person slows when they hear a sound that their body recognizes before their mind catches up. Then she heard her daughter's voice. Elsie was in the middle of the loose circle of people, and she wasn't running yet, but she had the look of a child who was calculating escape routes. Cray Dutton was there, and 2 of his usual companions, and 3 or 4 adults that Naomi recognized. Jim Hewitt from the hardware store, Clara Dutton herself. A woman named Patrice Stoller who taught Sunday school and had strong opinions about everything. Clara was smiling. Cray had apparently gotten hold of Elsie's reader, the one she only had one of, the one she'd read 3 times, and was holding it above his head just out of her reach, doing the thing boys do when they want to demonstrate that height is a form of power. Elsie was not jumping for it, which was the right call, but her face was white and tight and her hands were clenched at her sides. Ashford, Ashford, Cray was saying in a sing-song voice, doesn't even have a daddy to buy her a real book. Give it back, Elsie said. Her voice was steady, but it was costing her something. Why? Who's going to make me? Your mama? He looked around at the adults with the grinning confidence of a boy who knew exactly where his protection came from. Your mama can't do anything. She's just the sewing woman. Clara Dutton made a sound that was technically not a laugh, but functionally identical to one. Patrice Stoller said, Cray, that's enough now, in a tone that made it clear she meant nothing of the sort. Naomi walked into the circle. She didn't run. She made herself not run, because running would have looked like panic, and she had given enough of this town access to her panic. She walked at a normal pace until she was standing directly in front of Cray Dutton, and then she reached up without any particular drama and took the book from his raised hand because she was taller than him, and she handed it to Elsie without looking at her. The circle had gone quiet. She looked at Clara Dutton. Clara met her eyes with the expression of a woman who has been caught doing something she considers completely justified and intends to keep doing. Mrs. Ashford, Clara said pleasantly, we were just having a bit of fun. I see that, Naomi said. Children that age, they can be, well, the slight gesture again, the eloquent tilt of the head. It's a difficult situation for everyone. Difficult, Naomi repeated. Well, Clara spread her hands. A woman alone, a child without a father. People talk. Children hear things. You can't really blame them for... Stop. Clara blinked. Naomi's voice had not been loud. It had been the opposite of loud. It was the voice she used when she had run completely out of the energy required to keep things polite, which was a different kind of quiet from ordinary quiet. I have let this go on for 3 years because I thought it would stop on its own, and because I didn't want to cause trouble, and because I didn't have anyone standing behind me. I understand that. I've always understood that. But I'm telling you now, in front of everyone here, that if your son puts his hands on my daughter, or her property again, I will not let it go. I don't care what that costs me. The circle was completely still. Jim Hewitt was looking at his boots. Patrice Stoller's mouth had done something complicated. Clara Dutton's face had gone through several things and settled on a cold, settled fury that was considerably more honest than her smiling had been. "I see," she said very precisely. "Well, I suppose we'll all know where we stand then." "Yes," Naomi said. "I think that's a good idea." She put her hand on Elsie's shoulder and they walked out of the circle together, and she kept her hand there and her pace steady and her face forward all the way down the block, and she did not let herself shake until they were inside the shop with the door closed behind them. Then she sat down on the floor, not in a chair, on the actual floor, her back against the door, and she pressed her hands flat against her thighs and she breathed. Elsie sat down next to her without being asked. They stayed like that for a little while. "Mama?" Elsie said eventually. "I know. You said you'd let it go because you didn't have anyone standing behind you. I know what I said. Is that still true?" Naomi looked at her daughter. Elsie was holding her reader against her chest with both hands, like something rescued. "I don't know yet," Naomi said honestly. Elsie thought about this. "Mr. Briggs was there," she said. Naomi frowned. "He was? I didn't see him. He came around the corner when you were talking to Mrs. Dutton. He stopped." Elsie paused. "He didn't leave until we did." Naomi stared at her daughter. "He didn't say anything?" she asked. "No, he just stood there, back a little." Elsie considered. "I think he was making sure." Making sure. Naomi turned this over. A man who would stand at the edge of something, not intervening, just making sure. She wasn't sure if that was more or less complicated than if he'd stepped in directly. She got up off the floor. She went to the window and looked out at the street, which was ordinary and quiet in the late afternoon light, nobody remarkable visible in either direction. "Get washed up," she told Elsie. "Supper in an hour, thoughts." He came the following morning, not to drop off laundry this time. He knocked, and when she answered, he was standing with his hat in his hands and the expression of a man who has been rehearsing something and has decided at the last moment to say it differently. "Mrs. Ashford," he said, "I heard what happened yesterday." "I imagine the whole town heard," she said. "Probably." He turned his hat over once. "I was there. Part of it. Elsie told me." He nodded slowly. "I should have stepped in sooner. I was—" He stopped, looked at the hat. "I wasn't sure it was my place." "It wasn't," she said. Then because he'd been honest and it seemed fair to return that. "But I was glad you were there." He looked up. She stepped back from the door. "Come in, Mr. Briggs. I'll put coffee on." He came in, and he sat in the chair by the window where customers usually sat when they were waiting, and Naomi put the kettle on and got the cups down from the shelf, and the shop was quiet around them in the ordinary morning way, light through the windows, the smell of cotton and metal, and the faint dusty warmth of a working space. "I've been thinking," he said. "About what?" "About what happens next," he said, "for you and Elsie, in this town." She set a cup in front of him and sat across the work table. "What about it?" He looked at her directly, not the way men usually looked at her, which was either with calculation or with careful avoidance, but with the plain, steady attention of someone who has decided to say something true and is choosing how to do it. "Clara Dutton is not going to forgive what you said to her yesterday. She's going to make things harder. Her husband's on the town council. Jim Hewitt owes Gerald Dutton money. Patrice Stoller talks to everyone, and she doesn't like being made uncomfortable." He paused. "You already know all this." "Yes," she said. "And you said it anyway." "I did." He was quiet for a moment. Outside on the street, a wagon went past, the wheels loud on the dry boards. "I want to help," he said. "I'm not sure yet what that looks like. I'm not—" He stopped again, and she could see him being careful with the words, choosing them the way a person chooses footing on unfamiliar ground. "I'm not offering something I haven't thought through. I'm not the kind of man who makes promises he hasn't examined, but I want you to know that whatever I said to Clara Dutton in that schoolyard, I meant it, and I'm not going to walk it back because things get uncomfortable." Naomi looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the 4 years she'd spent managing things alone. She thought about all the times she'd made the careful choice, the quiet choice, the choice that kept things manageable, She thought about Elsie on the bench with her book, pressing her lips together so as not to cry in front of people who would have enjoyed it. She thought about what it had felt like to say stop to Clara Dutton's face. "Mr. Briggs," she said, "I appreciate what you're saying, but I need you to understand something." She kept her eyes on his. "I'm not looking to be rescued. I've been managing this alone for 4 years, and I know how to do it. What I can't manage is my daughter being taught every single day that she is worth less than other children because of the shape of her family. That's the thing I don't know how to fix on my own." He held her gaze. He didn't look away, and he didn't say anything reassuring, and he didn't soften it. "I understand that," he said. "That's why I'm here." The kettle had been quiet for a while. Neither of them moved to pour. "You know what they'll say," she said, "if you keep coming here, if people see you taking our side." "I know what they'll say," he said. "I've heard it already. Drummond told me last night that I was making a mistake. Pryor sent a message this morning that said something similar, less politely. He almost smiled, but it didn't quite make it. I'm not particularly concerned about Pryor's opinion of my decisions. And Clara Dutton? Clara Dutton has an inflated idea of how much influence she has over me," he said. "She's had that idea for about 10 years. I've never corrected it because it didn't matter. Now it does, so I'm correcting it." Naomi looked at this man sitting across her work table, turning his hat in his hands with the steady, deliberate patience of someone who has made a decision and is prepared to hold it. She thought about the fact that she didn't fully know him, and that not fully knowing someone was not the same as not having any information about them at all. She had 4 years of watching how people behaved in this town when they thought no one was making note of it. Colton Briggs had never, in 4 years, been among the ones who laughed. That was not nothing. She reached over and poured the coffee. "All right," she said. He looked at her. "I'm not saying yes to anything specific," she said. "I'm saying all right to the conversation." She pushed his cup toward him. "That's where we start." He took the cup and he didn't push further, which told her something too. What neither of them knew, sitting in the quiet of that ordinary morning, was that the conversation had already been noted. Patrice Stoller's niece lived in the rooming house across the street and had a habit of watching from her window. By noon, she'd told her aunt. By evening, Clara Dutton had a version of it. By the time Colton rode home that night through the cooling dark, Red Hollow was already composing the story it intended to tell about the two of them, and the story was not kind, and it was only just getting started. The weeks that followed were not easy, and anyone who expected them to be hadn't been paying attention. Red Hollow had its ways of making things difficult without doing anything that could be directly named or confronted. It was a town that understood the power of the indirect, the way a shopkeeper could suddenly take 10 minutes longer to fill a woman's order, the way invitations stopped arriving, the way conversations in the street went quieter when a certain person walked by and resumed at full volume the moment she passed. None of it was violence. None of it was even, technically, unkind. It was the slow, deliberate withdrawal of ordinary social warmth, and it was done with the practiced ease of a community that had been doing it to people who stepped out of line for as long as anyone could remember. Naomi noticed all of it and said nothing about any of it because naming it would have made it more real than she could currently afford. The seamstress business didn't collapse. That much was in her favor. People needed their clothes mended regardless of what they thought of the woman doing the mending, and several customers who'd been loyal for years continued to come without any change in their manner, either because they genuinely didn't care what Clara Dutton thought or because they were practical enough not to let social positioning interfere with a good hem. Mrs. Alcott came every week as she always had and pointedly did not mention any of the gossip, which was its own form of solidarity. The two Drummond sisters actually increased their orders, which Naomi suspected was less about their clothing needs and more about making a point to someone, though she didn't ask which point or to whom. But the other things shifted. The small, accumulated texture of daily life in the town, the nods in the street, the brief exchanges at the market, the ordinary frictionless transactions that made up the background of being a person in a community. Those went cooler and less certain, and Naomi felt it in a physical way, like weather. Elsie felt it too, though at school the dynamic had changed in ways that were harder to predict. Cray Dutton had gone quieter. Not kind, not even particularly subdued, but quieter, in the calculating way of a boy who is waiting to understand the new shape of things before choosing his next move. Some of the other children had shifted their behavior in small but detectable ways, a few of the girls beginning to sit near Elsie at the lunch bench rather than pointedly away from her. It wasn't friendship yet. It was more like caution. The caution of children who had noticed that the wind was changing direction and weren't ready to commit to any position until they could see where things were going to land. Colton came by the shop twice a week now, and he didn't pretend it was about laundry. They talked about the ranch, about the town, about Elsie's schoolwork, about the various complicated histories of the people involved in making their lives difficult. He had a straightforward manner of discussing hard things that Naomi found, unexpectedly, more comfortable than most people's attempts at delicacy. He didn't wrap things in softening language. He didn't look at her with pity, which was the thing she dreaded most from the beginning, that look men sometimes gave women in difficult situations, the look that was really a kind of satisfaction. He looked at her the way he looked at a fence line that needed assessment, carefully, directly, without judgment about how it had gotten into its current condition. She started to know him in the way you come to know someone, through the accumulation of small, unremarkable moments. She learned that he drank his coffee with no sugar, that he had an opinion about everything related to cattle and grassland and water rights, that he was a poor liar but an honest man, which were not always the same thing, and that he had a habit of going very still and very quiet when something bothered him, which she could read now as clearly as if he'd said it aloud. He'd lost his wife 5 years ago. He told her that simply, matter-of-factly, in the way of someone who has processed grief down to its essential facts. Margaret. Fever, like Thomas. 41 days from first symptom to end. No children, which he said without elaboration, but which she understood meant something that had not entirely healed. "Is that why?" she asked once, carefully. He looked at her. "Why what?" "Why you stopped, after. People said you pulled back from everything." He thought about it, really thought, which was something she'd come to expect from him. "Partly," he said. "Mostly, I just couldn't see the point of most things for a while. The ranch had to run, so I ran it. Everything else seemed like extra." He paused. It stopped feeling like extra, recently. She didn't ask him to explain that further. She already knew. Thus, the annual Red Hollow Frontier Festival came at the end of June, and it came whether anyone was ready for it or not. It had been a tradition for 15 years. 2 days of market stalls, livestock competitions, music in the evenings, a children's riding competition on the second afternoon that was the social centerpiece for most of the families in the county. People came from ranches and farms 30 miles out. The festival was the great leveling event of the Red Hollow calendar, the place where everyone was technically equal under the general festivity of it, which in practice meant everyone was on their best behavior in public while being considerably worse in the margins. Elsie had been talking about the riding competition for 3 weeks. She could ride, Naomi had made sure of that, borrowing a horse from the Drummond sisters' small stable on weekend mornings, letting Elsie practice in the open field behind their property until the girl had the seat and the balance and the easy confidence in the saddle that came from genuine repetition rather than just being told she was doing well. She was good at it, better than good. She had the instinctive communication with a horse that some people are just born with and others spend lifetimes reaching for. She wanted to enter the children's competition the way she wanted most things, quietly, carefully, without making too much noise about it in case wanting something too openly made it more likely to be taken away. Naomi entered her name on the registration sheet herself, a week before the festival, because she understood that her daughter would not have done it, and because she had made herself a private promise, after the evening she'd sat on the floor of the shop with her back against the door, that she was not going to let fear of what might happen be the thing that decided what happened. She did not tell Colton about it. She didn't want him to think she was staging something, asking for an audience. The festival morning was hot and bright and smelled of horses and cook fires and sawdust from the booths going up along the main avenue. Naomi had made Elsie a new dress for it, a practical one, not fussy, something she could actually move in. And she'd plaited her hair tight and pinned it close to her head so it wouldn't come loose in the saddle. Elsie stood at the edge of the festival grounds and took it all in with the same deliberate, cataloging attention she gave to everything, And then she squared her shoulders and said, "Okay," to no one in particular, and walked in. They were fine for the first hour. The market was genuinely good, better than the previous year, more vendors, some things Naomi hadn't been able to get through the usual suppliers. She let Elsie drag her from stall to stall and tried to be fully present in the pleasure of it, the ordinary good pleasure of being in a crowd on a bright summer morning with her daughter excited about something. She bought them both honey cakes from the baker who'd set up near the south entrance, and she ate hers standing up while Elsie examined a display of carved wooden horses with the focused intensity of a child conducting serious scientific research. She saw Colton once, across the crowd. He was talking to a man she recognized as one of the outlying ranchers, deep in what looked like a serious conversation, and she caught his eye briefly and he nodded and she nodded back, and they moved on in their separate directions, which was how things were between them. Not complicated, just real. The children's riding competition was set for 2 in the afternoon, and at 1:30, Naomi and Elsie made their way to the livestock area where the ring had been set up and the children who'd registered were gathering with their horses. There were 12 children entered. Elsie knew 3 of them from school, 2 boys she'd never had particular trouble with, and a girl named Vera Stoller, Patrice's daughter, who had learned her mother's habit of the pointed sidelong glance. They got Elsie's borrowed horse from where Naomi had arranged to tie him that morning, a steady quarter horse named Owen, who was generous with children and had apparently decided early in his career not to be bothered by noise or crowds. Elsie checked his girth strap with the seriousness of a professional, adjusted it, checked it again, and then stood with her hand on his neck and breathed slowly the way Naomi had taught her to do before anything that made her nervous. "You're ready," Naomi said. "I know," Elsie said. "I'm just making sure Owen knows, too." Naomi almost smiled. They walked toward the ring entrance, and that was when Augusta Pryor appeared. Augusta was Harold Pryor's mother, 70 years old, sharp as a new fence post, and the closest thing Red Hollow had to a founding matriarch. She had been at every festival for 15 years, and she had opinions about everything that happened at all of them, and her opinions carried weight that Clara Dutton's wealth couldn't quite match, because Augusta Pryor's opinions were backed by actual history in this territory, by the kind of standing that comes from being in a place before it was a town. She stepped in front of them at the ring entrance, not aggressively, deliberately. She looked at Elsie. She looked at the horse. She looked at the registration board mounted on the post beside the gate. "Ashford," she said, reading the name off the board. "You're Naomi Ashford's girl." "Yes, ma'am," Elsie said. Augusta Pryor looked at her for a long moment. Then she looked at Naomi. "This you're doing?" "She entered herself," Naomi said, which was not quite true but was true enough. Augusta looked back at the board. "This competition is for families with standing in the county," she said. "That's been the rule for 15 years. The children who compete here represent their family names, their father's holdings." She paused, and her voice was not cruel. It was something worse than cruel, which was indifferent. "This child has no father listed, no holding, no family representation. I'm not sure she qualifies." The area near the gate had gone quiet in the way of public spaces that are very suddenly paying attention. Elsie did not move. She kept her hand on Owen's neck, and she looked at Augusta Pryor with those steady Thomas eyes, and she did not, by any visible measure, shake. Naomi opened her mouth. She didn't get the chance to say anything, because behind Augusta Pryor, at the edge of the small silent crowd that had gathered, there was movement, a single person making their way forward with the unhurried, ground-covering stride of a man who has decided exactly what he is going to do and sees no reason to do it in a rush. Colton Briggs came through the gap in the crowd, and he walked to where Elsie was standing, and he stopped in front of her, and he crouched down the way he had that first morning in the schoolyard, getting himself to her level, making the conversation between them, and not between him and the audience that had assembled around them. He looked at Elsie. Her chin was up. Her jaw was tight. Her eyes were bright in the way eyes go bright when a person is holding something back that is very large and very close to the surface. He took off his hat. It was a rancher's hat, old, shaped by years of use, the kind of hat that carries the particular character of its owner in the way the brim has been broken and the crease worn in. He turned it once in his hands, and then he placed it gently on Elsie's head. It was too big for her, of course. It sat low over her ears, and she had to tilt her head back slightly to see out from under the brim, and she looked up at him from underneath it with an expression that was somewhere between astonishment and a question she didn't have words for yet. "You have one now," he said. His voice was quiet, not performing, not pitched for the crowd. It was the voice of a man talking to a child, and if the people around them could hear it, and they could, because the silence was total, that was their business, not his. Elsie stared at him from under the brim of his hat. "A family name," he said. "A holding in this county. A man standing behind you." He paused. "If you'll have it." The silence held for another beat. Then Elsie, still looking at him from under the hat that was too big for her, said in a voice that was very careful and very quiet, "You mean that?" "I don't say things I don't mean," he said. She looked at him for one more moment. Then she gave a single, small nod. The nod of a child who has decided to trust something and knows it is a significant decision. He stood. He turned to face Augusta Pryor, who was looking at him with an expression that had moved through surprise and arrived somewhere more complicated. Behind her, the assembled crowd had the particular quality of people who have just witnessed something they hadn't expected and haven't finished processing yet. "Ma'am," Colton said. He was entirely courteous. "I'd like to enter this child as a representative of the Briggs holding. My ranch is registered in this county. My name is on the board. If the rule is family standing, she has it." Augusta Pryor looked at him for a long time. "That's a serious thing to say in public, Colton," she said. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "That's why I said it in public." Something shifted in Augusta's face. Not warmth exactly, but a kind of recognition. She was old enough and had been in this territory long enough to know the difference between a man making a gesture and a man making a declaration, and she was experienced enough in the weight of words spoken before witnesses to understand what kind she'd just heard. She stepped aside. "Then she qualifies," Augusta said, and she walked away. The crowd exhaled. Naomi heard it, a physical sound, the collective breath of 40 people releasing something they'd been holding. She heard someone say something she couldn't make out, and someone else respond, and then the ordinary sounds of the festival began to reassemble around them, cautiously, like birds coming back to a branch after something has startled them. Naomi had not moved. She was standing exactly where she had been standing when Colton walked through the crowd, and she was looking at the back of his head because he was still facing in the direction Augusta Pryor had gone, and she was trying to find the shape of what she was feeling, which was large and complicated and did not fit neatly into any category she had a name for. He turned around. He looked at her, and he must have seen something in her face because his own expression did something careful and uncertain, and he opened his mouth and then closed it, which was not a thing she'd ever seen him do before. "I should have asked you first," he said. "Before I—" He stopped. "I didn't think. I saw her face and I just—" "Don't apologize for it," Naomi said. Her voice came out rougher than she intended. He looked at her. "Don't," she said again. "Please." He nodded. Once. Elsie, who had been watching this exchange from under the hat with Owen's reins in her hands, said, "Can I go line up now?" Both adults looked at her. "Yes," Naomi said. "Go." Elsie turned and walked toward the ring with Owen, and the hat was still on her head, enormous and tilted and entirely undignified. And she wore it with the absolute straight-back composure of a child who has decided that this is her hat now and has no further questions about the matter. Naomi watched her go. "You said family," she said, without looking at Colton. "I know what I said." "You said you'd stand behind her." "I know." She turned to look at him then. He met her eyes with the same directness he always had, steady and undeflected, but there was something underneath it now that she hadn't seen before, or maybe hadn't let herself see. Something that was waiting rather than pushing, something that was not going to move on its own but wasn't going anywhere either. "What exactly are you proposing, Mr. Briggs?" she said. He held her gaze. "I think you know." "I want to hear you say it." He breathed in slowly. "I'm proposing," he said, "that Elsie Ashford become Elsie Briggs, legally, through whatever process the court requires." He paused. "And I'm proposing that her mother consider becoming Naomi Briggs, if she's willing." The noise of the festival continued around them. Children calling to each other, the creak of wagon wheels, Music starting up somewhere near the main avenue, the smell of smoke and horses and summer. All of it entirely ordinary, all of it entirely oblivious to what was happening in this one specific patch of ground near the livestock ring. Not out of pity, he added, and his voice was careful on that. I want to be plain about that. I'm not standing here out of pity for your situation. I'm standing here because for the last 2 months, I've walked into that shop twice a week and not wanted to leave. And because your daughter sat there that first day and told me that long division was terrible and hasn't let me pretend I wasn't already involved ever since. Something in his expression shifted slightly, toward something dry and almost wry. I'm not what you'd call an impulsive man. You know that. This isn't impulse. Naomi looked at him. She thought about 4 years of managing alone, and about Elsie's face that first night, and about the weight of carrying something that had been designed for 2 people and carrying it with only 2 hands. She thought about the way this man had walked into a schoolyard without a plan, because he couldn't keep walking. She thought about the cup of coffee she'd pushed across the work table and the conversation she'd told herself was just a start. She thought about what it would mean to say yes, what it would cost practically in terms of the town's opinion, in terms of the adjustment required, in terms of everything that was uncertain and complicated and possibly wrong about a decision made this fast and under these circumstances. She thought about Elsie wearing that hat. I'm not saying yes today, she said. I know, he said. I'm saying that I heard you, and that I'm not saying no. He nodded, and she could see the thing behind his eyes release slightly. Not relief exactly, but the letting go of attention that had been held carefully for longer than this afternoon. That's fair, he said. It's all I've got right now, she said. It's enough, he said. From inside the ring came the sound of the competition judge calling the first heat to order, and then the small thunder of hooves on packed earth, and Naomi turned to find a place to watch from, and Colton fell into step beside her, and neither of them said anything else for a while. Elsie took third in the first heat and first in the second, and she did it wearing a rancher's hat that was 3 sizes too large and that she never once took off. And when she came out of the ring afterward, her face was something Naomi had not seen in 3 years. Openly, uncalculatedly happy, the face of a child who has just done something well in front of people who were watching, and who has not been punished for it. She ran to them both, not just to Naomi, to both of them in the way children run to the people they have decided belong to them, without consultation, without ceremony, because children understand belonging the way adults sometimes forget to, not as something you argue into existence, but as something you simply recognize when you feel it. She hit Colton at speed which he was not expecting, and he grabbed her by the shoulders to keep her from bouncing off him entirely, and the hat fell off her head into the dirt, and for a moment all 3 of them just stood there, the girl catching her breath, the man steadying her, the woman watching, and the festival moved around them like water around 3 stones in a stream, and nothing about the moment was graceful or composed or planned. It was the most honest thing that had happened in Red Hollow in a very long time. What none of them saw in that moment was Gerald Dutton standing 30 feet away with his arms crossed, watching, and next to him, Jim Hewitt, and 3 other men Colton would have recognized as competitors for county water rights if he'd been looking. Gerald Dutton watched Colton Briggs pick the hat up off the ground and put it back on the little girl's head, and his expression did the thing that expressions do when a man has just understood something he didn't know he was going to have to deal with, and has started calculating what it's going to require. He leaned over and said something quiet to Jim Hewitt. Jim Hewitt nodded. The festival continued around them, bright and loud and ordinary, and none of the 3 people near the livestock ring knew that by the time the evening fires were lit, and the music started and the day settled into its warm, exhausted close, the thing that had begun in a schoolyard 2 months ago had just become something considerably larger than any of them had planned for. Gerald Dutton was not a man who moved fast on anything. That was the thing people who underestimated him always got wrong. They saw the deliberate pace, the considered speech, the way he took his time with decisions that other men made quickly, and they read it as slowness. It wasn't slowness. It was the particular patience of a man who had learned early that the best time to act was after everyone else had assumed the moment had passed. He waited 3 days after the festival. Then he called a meeting. It was held at the Dutton house, where Not in the parlor where Clara hosted her social gatherings, but in the back study where Gerald conducted the business he didn't want his wife discussing at her dinner parties. 6 men came. Jim Hewitt from the hardware store, who owed the Dutton Bank a number that kept him cooperative. Frank Stoller, Patrice's husband, who ran the grain supply and had adjacent land interests. 2 ranchers from the North County, the Marsh brothers, who had been in a boundary dispute with the Briggs Ranch for 4 years and had found it convenient to let the matter sit unresolved because resolved meant they lost. And Orrin Vance, who had no particular grudge against Colton Briggs, but who had a gift for the mechanical work of harassment, fences, livestock, the kind of damage that looked like accident, and who charged a reasonable rate for his services. They talked for 2 hours. When they finished, the shape of what was going to happen had been decided, though none of them would have used a word as direct as that. They used words like concern and community standards and protecting the county's interests, which were the words men used in back rooms when they wanted to do something they knew they couldn't defend in daylight. Gerald walked them out and went back to his study and sat for a while in the quiet. He had nothing specific against Colton Briggs personally. He'd done business with him for 12 years and found him straightforward enough. What he had against him now was simpler and more fundamental than personal. Colton had stood in the middle of a public event and made a declaration that shifted the social math of Red Hollow, and social math was Gerald Dutton's business. It was the thing he managed, carefully and continuously, the way a rancher manages water, knowing where it was going, and who controlled it. Colton's declaration at the festival had moved things in a direction Gerald hadn't authorized. That was the problem, not the woman, not the child, not even the principle of the thing. The problem was that Colton Briggs had made a move on the board without checking with the people who considered themselves responsible for the board. That, Gerald thought, needed correcting. Well, the first thing happened on a Monday night. Dale Sutter found it at first light Tuesday. 3 sections of the south fence line, cut clean, not broken, cut, with something sharp and deliberate. The cattle that had been in the south pasture were gone, scattered across the open range in 3 directions. It took 8 men the better part of a day to bring them back, and by the time the count was done, they were 4 head short, which in a week of good market prices was a number that had a specific dollar value attached to it. Colton walked the fence line himself that afternoon, crouching down to look at the cut ends of the wire, running his thumb along the clean edge the way a man reads a surface for information. "That's not accident," Dale said, standing behind him. "No," Colton said. "You know who?" "I've got a guess." He stood. "Don't say it out loud. Not yet." Dale looked at him sideways. "You going to do something about it?" "I'm going to think about what needs doing," Colton said, "which isn't the same thing, but it's where you have to start." He went back to the house and sat at the table with the ranch ledger and the survey report he still had in his coat pocket and a cup of coffee that went cold while he was working through things in his head. The fence could be repaired. The cattle could mostly be replaced if they didn't recover the 4 missing head. Neither thing by itself would ruin him. The question was whether either thing by itself was what was actually coming. He rode into town the next morning and went to the shop. Naomi looked at his face when she opened the door and said, "What happened?" "Fence cut, 4 cattle gone." He came in and sat in his usual chair. "South pasture." She sat across from him. "How bad?" "Manageable for now." He looked at his hands. "It's not the fences I'm worried about." "Tell me." He did. The full shape of it, including the names he wasn't yet saying aloud, but could see clearly enough if he looked at the pieces side by side. Naomi listened without interrupting, which was one of the things about her that he'd come to rely on without fully realizing it. The quality of her attention when something needed to be understood rather than just heard. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "They're not trying to ruin you," she said. "Not yet. They're trying to give you a reason to reconsider." He looked at her. "This is a cost they're showing you," she said. "They want you to do the arithmetic, figure out whether we're worth it." The word we sat between them without comment, which was its own kind of thing. "I did that arithmetic a while ago," he said. "I know." She got up and refilled his coffee, which had gone cold again. "But they don't know you did. They think you're still the man who can be moved by pressure." She set the cup down. "Are you going to tell them you're not?" I'm trying to figure out the right way to do that, he said. Doing it wrong makes things worse. She nodded. She sat back down and she looked at him with those even, steady eyes that had a way of cutting through to whatever was actually in front of them. What do you need from me? He thought about that. Not the automatic deflection, not the instinct to say nothing. I'll manage. That had been his default for 5 years. Actually thought about it. I need you at the ranch, he said. Not permanently, not yet. I know we haven't settled anything between us, but I need someone who can see the operations clearly while I'm dealing with the outside problems. Dale is a good foreman, but he doesn't see the whole picture. He sees cattle and fences. He doesn't see the books or the scheduling or what happens if we lose 3 more hands because someone in town tells their families we're trouble to work for. She was quiet for a moment. You're asking me to leave the shop. Part-time, whatever you can manage. Bring Elsie if you have to. There's room enough. She looked at him. That's going to look like exactly what it isn't yet. I know, he said. I can't fix that right now. She was quiet for a moment longer. Then, let me think about it. He nodded. He picked up his coffee. Colton, she said. He looked at her. They're going to keep going, she said. It won't be just fences. I know, he said. I'm ready for that. She looked at him for another moment, the careful assessing look that he'd stopped finding uncomfortable because it was never looking for weakness. It was just looking for what was true. Then she nodded once and turned back to the work on her bench, and he finished his coffee and left. He was 3 blocks from the shop when he passed Jim Hewitt on the boardwalk. Jim nodded to him. Entirely normal, entirely pleasant. Colton nodded back. Neither of them stopped. The second thing happened 4 days later. Word moved through the ranch hand population of Red Hollow the way bad news always moves, faster than wind, quieter than you'd expect. 3 of Colton's hired men gave notice within 48 hours of each other. None of them gave the same reason, but the reasons all had the same texture. A family situation, a better offer, a need to be closer to town. One of the men, a young hand named Perry, who'd been with the Briggs Ranch for 2 years and had never given a moment's trouble, wouldn't quite meet Colton's eyes when he handed back his bunkhouse key. Perry, Colton said. I'm sorry, Mr. Briggs, Perry said to a point slightly past Colton's left shoulder. It's just time. Who talked to you? Perry's jaw tightened. He didn't say anything. You don't have to tell me, Colton said. But I want you to know it changes nothing on my end. If you want to come back when this is settled, the position is yours. Perry finally looked at him, and there was something in his face that was close to shame. I got a sister in town, he said. Her husband works for Hewitt. I understand, Colton said. Perry left. Colton went and found Dale. 3 men, Dale said, before Colton could say it. He was already doing the math. The practical math of what 3 fewer hands meant in terms of workload distribution and which operations would have to wait. We can carry it short term if nothing major comes up. Something major is going to come up, Colton said. Plan for it. What kind of major? I don't know yet, Colton said. That's what's bothering me. Naomi arrived the following Monday. She came with Elsie on a Saturday morning first, just to see the place. Colton had suggested it, and she had agreed with the same careful pragmatism she brought to most things, acknowledging that making a decision about something you'd never seen was a way of making decisions badly. She stood in the ranch yard and looked at the house, the outbuildings, the pastures running south toward the low ridge, the creek line marked by a ribbon of cottonwoods to the east, and she was quiet for a long time. Elsie was not quiet. Elsie had gone directly to the nearest fence and was studying the horses in the adjacent paddock with the concentrated rapture of a child who has found the right place for herself, and she had already, within approximately 4 minutes, identified Owen's twin in terms of temperament and begun a preliminary relationship with him through the fence rails. It's a lot, Naomi said. It is, Colton agreed, standing beside her. More than I imagined. Is that a problem? She considered. No, she said. It's just more than I imagined. He almost smiled. She came back Monday with a bag that was big enough for a week and her sewing kit, because she would not stop working, and she didn't. She sat up on the table in the front room and continued her mending orders in the mornings, and in the afternoons she went through the ranch books with the same careful, systematic attention she brought to a pattern that wasn't quite right, looking for where things didn't line up, where the numbers said one thing and the operation suggested another. On the third day she found it. "Your grain supplier," she said, when Colton came in at midday. He washed his hands at the basin. "What about him?" "Frank Stoller has been overbilling you for 18 months. She turned the ledger so he could see it. "Not by much each time, small enough that it looks like rounding, but look at the pattern." She'd marked a series of entries with a straight pin, a habit from her sewing work that she apparently applied to everything. Month to month, across 18 months, it adds up to $140, Colton said, looking at the numbers. $152, she said. "I'm still counting." He stared at the ledger. He looked at her. "I never checked it line by line." "Most people don't," she said, without making it an indictment. "You trusted him because you'd been dealing with him for years and the numbers were never dramatically wrong. That's not carelessness. It's just how trust works until it doesn't." He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. "Frank Stoller?" he said. "Was at that meeting, I'd guess," she said, "based on who has reason and who has access." He looked at the ledger for another moment. "This is documentation," he said. "Yes," she said. "Keep the records. Don't do anything with them yet." She looked at him steadily. "When the time comes, you want paper, not anger." He looked at her. "My husband used to say that anger is what you feel in the moment and paper is what you have in the morning," she said. He was right about that, at least. Colton nodded slowly. He closed the ledger. "I'll get the records going back 3 years," he said. "If he's been doing it 18 months, there may be more." "There probably is," she said, and turned back to her work. The wildfire started on a Thursday. It came from the northwest, which was the wrong direction. Fires on that range usually came up from the dry creek beds to the south, and everyone built their preparation around that assumption. This one started in the tall grass beyond the Marsh Brothers' property, in a patch of ground that had been dry for 6 weeks and needed only the right conditions. And the right conditions arrived on Thursday afternoon in the form of a wind shift that nobody had been watching for because nobody had been watching the northwest. Colton smelled it before he saw it. That was how wildfire usually announced itself. Not visually, not yet, but in the air, the particular sharp, dry smell of grass burning at distance, carried on a wind that was stronger than it had been an hour ago. He was at the south fence line with Dale when it hit him. He turned northwest and stood for 3 seconds, reading the sky, and then he said, "Get everyone to the creek pasture. Move the horses first, then the cattle from the east paddock. Don't stop for anything else." Dale was already running. Colton went for his horse. The fire had a 20-minute head start on them by the time he could see it from the ridge. A line of orange moving fast across the grass, pushed by the wind, eating ground at the pace of a trotting horse. He knew the spread pattern from the slope of the land. It would hit the east paddock first, then push toward the main outbuildings if the wind held its current direction. The creek was the natural break, but the creek was 200 yards of open ground from the east fence, and 200 yards of open ground was a lot to cross with panicked cattle in front of a moving fire. He rode back at a full gallop. The ranch was already organized chaos when he got there. Dale had the hands moving, the horses were out and headed for the creek. But the east paddock cattle were not cooperating, which cattle rarely did in the presence of smoke, and 2 of the remaining hands were trying to work the gate and having a bad time of it because the animals were pressing the wrong direction. Naomi was in the yard. She should not have been in the yard. He'd told her, when she arrived, that in any emergency the protocol was the house first and then the creek if the house was threatened, because that was where the books and the papers were, and because she was not a ranch hand and had no business in the middle of a working emergency. She was in the yard anyway, and she'd apparently made the independent assessment that the 2 hands at the cattle gate needed a third person because she was there, doing the thing that needed doing, which was pushing from the opposite side to redirect the animals. He didn't have time to argue about it. He went to the gate and the 3 of them worked the cattle for 11 hard minutes, and at the end of 11 minutes the east paddock was clear and the gate was latched and the animals were moving toward the creek, and Naomi had a bruise forming on her forearm from where she'd caught the fence rail, but she was upright and moving. "House," he said to her, not stopping. Books are already at the creek, she said. I moved them when I smelled the smoke. He stopped. He looked at her. Ledgers, survey records, the grain billing documentation, she said, as if this were completely ordinary information. I put them in the waterproof box under the house table and carried it out 15 minutes ago. She looked at him steadily, breathing hard. Was I wrong? He stared at her for another second. No, he said. You were right. Go. She went. He turned back to the fire. What happened with Elsie, he found out afterward from Dale, who had seen it from the far side of the creek. Elsie had been in the barn when the fire started, not doing anything she'd been told not to do, just sitting in the hayloft with a book, which was where she'd taken to going in the afternoons because it was quiet up there and the light came in at a good angle. When she smelled the smoke, she climbed down and she didn't panic, which was the thing Dale kept coming back to when he told it. She'd climbed down and she'd looked at the fire, which was visible from the barn door by then, and she'd done the calculation that an 8-year-old had apparently been doing quietly in the background since she arrived on this ranch, which was understanding where everything was and how it connected. The Garner family, a family of 4 who leased a small piece of land from Colton on the eastern edge of his property, were half a mile east of the barn and directly in the fire's path, and they didn't know it yet because they couldn't see it from where they were. Elsie took the nearest horse, not Owen. Owen was already at the creek. She took the next one, a steady bay mare she'd been watching all week, and she did not waste time finding a saddle, and she rode. Dale saw her coming out of the barn at a gallop and shouted after her, and she did not stop, and he said afterward that for a moment he didn't know whether to chase her or trust her, and then he understood where she was going, and he let her go because she was already ahead of him, and she was moving fast enough that stopping to explain would have cost more than it saved. She reached the Garner property in under 4 minutes. Tom Garner came out of his house at the sound of a horse arriving at that speed, and he looked at an 8-year-old girl on a bareback bay mare pointing northwest with all the urgency her small frame could produce, and he understood the message before she got a word out. They were moving in 2 minutes. Tom Garner, with his wife and 2 small children, all of them going east to the road, clear of the fire's path, with enough time that they made it with distance to spare. Elsie rode back. She came back to find the fire contained at the creek line, the wind having shifted back in the last 20 minutes, the way wind on the plains sometimes does, as if it has simply lost interest. The outbuildings were untouched. The house was untouched. The cattle were safe at the creek, and 3 of Colton's remaining hands were walking the fire perimeter to check for anything still burning in the grass. Colton found her at the barn, unsaddling the mare with more efficiency than he'd expected from someone her size. He didn't say anything immediately. He stood and watched her work, and he thought about Tom Garner's family on their way east, and about the 50 feet of difference it would have made if she'd left 5 minutes later, and he felt something in his chest that was complicated enough that he needed a moment with it before he could say anything at all. You did that well, he said finally. She didn't look up from the saddle. The cinch is stuck, she said. He came over and freed the cinch without comment. They finished the unsaddling together in silence. I knew where they were, she said when the mare was settled. I saw them when we first came, last week. I always look at where everything is. I know, he said. That's a good habit. She looked up at him then, and her face was dirty from the smoke, and her hair had come entirely out of its plait, and she had a grass cut on her left cheek, and she looked about as far from the careful, defended child who had sat alone on a school bench with her reader as it was possible to get. Is everyone okay? She asked. Everyone's okay, he said. She nodded. She patted the mare's neck once, then stepped back. Then I'm going to go find Mama, she said, and walked out of the barn. He stood in the quiet of the barn for a moment after she left. The smell of smoke was still strong in the air, and somewhere down at the creek the cattle were settling back into their ordinary sounds, and the light was going long and gold the way it did late in the afternoon when the day had burned down to its last hour. He thought about a board of men in a back room calculating what it would cost him. He thought about fences cut and hands bought away and billing records falsified over 18 months. He thought about what they hadn't calculated. They hadn't calculated Naomi moving the paperwork before the fire. They hadn't calculated an 8-year-old who looked at a ranch when she arrived and mapped it the way a person maps the place they intend to stay. They hadn't calculated the simple, durable fact that what they'd tried to undermine was not just one man and his property. It was three people who had already started to function as a thing with its own weight and its own logic, and that was considerably harder to move than one man alone. He walked out of the barn into the smoke-tinged evening air, and he went to find them both. The hands who'd stayed, 7 of them now, the ones who hadn't been bought away, were gathered near the creek when he got there. They'd been watching the firefight all afternoon. They'd watched Naomi at the cattle gate. Several of them had heard from Dale about Elsie and the Garner family by now. Word traveled fast in a small working crew, especially news of that kind. Will Cord, who was 26 years old and had been on the Briggs ranch for 3 years and had turned down 2 quiet conversations from men who were not his employer, looked up when Colton approached and said, "What do you need us to do tomorrow, boss?" It was not a complicated question, but it was a deliberate one, said in front of the others, said with the full weight of, "I'm still here," which under the circumstances was the same as saying more than that. "The south fence line needs resetting," Colton said. "Creek pasture needs clearing after the cattle went through, and I need 2 men to ride the fire perimeter at first light." "That's a full day," Will said. "It is," Colton said. "I appreciate it." Will nodded and turned back to the fire perimeter, and that was the end of it, which was exactly how it should have been. Naomi was sitting on the creek bank with the waterproof box beside her, and her shoes off, and her feet in the water, which was approximately the most undignified position he'd ever seen her in, and also the most tired she'd ever looked. Elsie was lying in the grass behind her with her eyes closed, the mare's lead rope loose in her hand, the horse grazing peacefully at the end of it. He sat down on the bank beside Naomi. She didn't say anything. He didn't say anything either, for a while. The creek moved this way creeks move in summer, low and clear, busy with its own small logic. The smoke smell was lighter down here, cut by the water's coolness. Above them the sky was going pink and orange along the western edge, completely indifferent to the day's specific dramas. "The Garners are all right," he said. "I know," she said. "Tom came by before they headed east. He wanted me to tell you." "They could have lost everything." "They didn't," she said. He looked at the creek. "Because of Elsie." "Yes," she said. She didn't say it proudly, exactly. She said it the way she said most things, as a plain fact that didn't require embellishment. He was quiet for a moment. "Naomi," he said. "I know," she said. "I haven't asked you yet. Not properly." She looked sideways at him. "You asked me at the festival." "That wasn't proper," he said. "That was reactive. In front of people." He paused. "You deserve better than reactive and in front of people." She turned to look at him fully, and the evening light was on her face, and she looked tired and smoke-smudged and entirely, unflinchingly herself, which was the thing about her he'd stopped being able to do without. "Are you asking me again?" she said. "Yes," he said. She looked at him for a long moment. The creek moved. Behind them, Elsie breathed the deep, slow breath of a child who has fallen asleep in open air at the end of a hard day, which was a sound Naomi knew so well it had its own place in the part of her that kept track of things she couldn't afford to lose. "All right," she said. He looked at her. "Yes," she said clearly, quietly, without hesitation. "That's my answer." He reached over and took her hand, not dramatically, not with any performance for an audience that wasn't there, just took it the way you take the hand of someone you have decided is yours, and she let him, and they sat together on the creek bank in the smoke-colored evening while the Briggs ranch settled around them into a quiet that felt, for the first time in a long time on both sides, like something they could rest in. The morning after the fire, Tom Garner rode back. He came alone, without his wife or children, which meant he'd come to say something specific and didn't want witnesses to the saying of it. He tied his horse at the rail and found Colton at the south fence line, where the repair work had already started at first light the way Colton had said it would. Will Cord and 2 other hands working the wire, while Dale directed the post setting 30 yards down. Tom was a lean, weathered man in his mid-40s who had homesteaded his piece of leased land 8 years ago and built everything on it with 2 hands and no particular advantage. He and Colton had always had a straightforward relationship, landlord and tenant, civil and uncomplicated, with the kind of mutual respect that comes from two men who recognize in each other a willingness to do hard work without complaint. He stood beside Colton and looked at the fence line for a moment without saying anything. "Garner," Colton said. "I wanted to come back," Tom said. When it was quiet, he turned his hat over in his hands, a gesture Colton recognized, having done it himself often enough. "My youngest is 4 years old. She was asleep in the back room when that fire was moving." Colton waited. "That little girl of yours," Tom said. "She ride like that all the time?" "Apparently," Colton said. Tom was quiet for another moment. "I heard what happened at the festival," he said. "Before that, I heard what's been going on in town." He looked at the fence. "I want you to know, whatever's being said, whatever Dutton and his people are putting around, it doesn't change anything on my end. My lease is with you. My word is with you." He paused. "I've got 2 neighbors who feel the same. Couldn't speak for them this morning, but I will when I see them." Colton looked at him. "I'm not asking for anything," Tom said quickly, as if he wanted to be clear about that. This isn't a negotiation. I just thought you ought to know there are people on this range who see what's happening and who it's happening to." Colton put out his hand. Tom took it. That was all that needed to be said, and neither of them said anything more. What Gerald Dutton had not anticipated in his careful backroom calculations was documentation. He'd anticipated anger, the kind of anger that made men do things they couldn't defend later, the kind that gave you grounds to go to the town council and talk about what a man of unstable character Colton Briggs was turning out to be. He'd anticipated maybe a confrontation, something public and loud, something that could be characterized in a particular way afterward. He had not anticipated a woman who had been running a small business alone for 4 years and who kept records the way some people kept their children, carefully, thoroughly, with the understanding that they were the thing you'd need most when things went wrong. Naomi spent 4 days after the fire going through everything. She worked at the front room table in the evenings after Elsie was asleep, the ledgers open beside her sewing, a cup of tea going cold at her elbow, her handwriting filling a separate notebook with dates and figures and cross-references that anyone who knew what they were looking at would have no trouble understanding. Frank Stoller's billing irregularities went back not 18 months, but 26, and the total, when she finished adding it, was $211. She found a separate issue in the land registry records Colton pulled from the county office, a boundary notation on the Marsh Brothers shared line that had been filed with a description that didn't match the original survey from 12 years ago, which meant someone had either made a significant clerical error or had gone to the county office with a specific purpose in mind. She put everything in order. She made 2 copies of the summary, in her own hand, clear and numbered. She set one copy as a waterproof box and kept the other in her sewing kit, because she understood that the point of documentation was not just having it, but having it in more than one place. She told Colton what she'd found on the 5th day, spread across the table between them over morning coffee. He read through it slowly. He was not a man who rushed through numbers or skimmed what needed to be read carefully, which was one of the things she'd noticed about him early and which had told her something important. He read it twice, the second time going back to specific entries and checking them against the original ledger she had opened beside the summary. When he finished, he sat back. "The boundary notation," he said. "Filed 8 months ago," she said, 4 months before the first fence cut. He looked at her. "They were planning this longer than I thought." "Probably," she said. "Or the boundary thing was opportunity, and the rest developed after the festival." She turned her coffee cup in her hands. "It doesn't matter which. What matters is the paper says what it says, and their actions say what they say, and a judge can look at both." "You want to take this to court?" he said. "I want to take it to someone official before they do something that can't be repaired," she said. "The fences can be fixed. The hands who left can be replaced. But if they get the boundary notation formalized before you challenge it, it becomes considerably more complicated." She met his eyes. "You need a lawyer, Colton, and you need him before they make another move." He was quiet for a moment, not in disagreement, but in the processing way of a man who had been handling things alone for a long time and was still adjusting to the fact that he didn't have to. "There's a man in Calford," he said, "Matthew Ives. He handled the original survey when I bought the South Pasture. He knows this land. Write to him today, she said. He wrote that afternoon. The reply came back in 6 days, and Matthew Ives arrived in Red Hollow 10 days after that, a compact, sharp-eyed man in his 50s who looked at Naomi's documentation for 2 hours and then looked at Colton over the top of his reading glasses and said, "You've got a tidy case here. Who did the records work?" "She did," Colton said. Ives looked at Naomi. "You have a very organized mind, Mrs. Ashford." "Briggs," Colton said quietly. Ives raised an eyebrow slightly, but adjusted without comment. "Mrs. Briggs," he said. Naomi said nothing, but something in her settled at that, the way a thing settles when it has been named correctly for the first time. The proceedings didn't happen overnight. Nothing involving land records and billing disputes and county filings ever did, and anyone who expected the legal machinery of a frontier territory to move quickly had not dealt with it before. What Matthew Ives did first was file a formal challenge to the boundary notation on record, which required the county surveyor to produce the original documentation and account for the discrepancy. The county surveyor, a nervous man named Bridle, who had held the position for 3 years and had no particular loyalty to Gerald Dutton beyond the kind that comes from avoiding trouble, produced the original documentation and could not account for the discrepancy, which told its own story without anyone having to tell it directly. The grain billing issue went to the county magistrate as a separate matter, a civil dispute, straightforward enough, with Naomi's summary and the original invoices laid side by side. Frank Stoller's attorney argued clerical error, which the magistrate found somewhat difficult to sustain across 26 months and $211 of consistent rounding in one direction. These things took time. They took 3 months of filings and responses and postponements and the particular grinding patience of formal process, during which Red Hollow continued to be Red Hollow, opinionated, watchful, and thoroughly unable to stop talking about what it was watching. But the watching changed quality during those 3 months, and the change was slow and unannounced, the way most real changes are. Tom Garner told his neighbors what he'd told Colton, and his neighbors told theirs, and the story of Elsie and the bareback horse, and the Garner family's 4-year-old asleep in the back room when the fire was moving. That story moved through the ranching community the way the best stories always do, not through newspapers or announcement, but person to person, at fence lines and water troughs, and the long, quiet evenings when people who work the land talk about what happened and what it means. Will Cord and the hands who'd stayed talked too, in the quieter places. The bunkhouse, the feed store, the corner of the livery where working men gathered after hours. They talked about Naomi at the cattle gate with the bruise forming on her forearm. They talked about the ledgers in the waterproof box, moved before the fire reached the house. They talked, carefully and without naming names, about the men who'd been approached with certain quiet suggestions, and what those suggestions had implied, and what it said about who was running what kind of operation in Red Hollow County. Perry, the young hand who'd given notice because of his sister's husband, came back at the 6-week mark. He stood at the ranch gate on a Tuesday morning, and he didn't say much. He was not a man of many words on a good day, and he had even fewer for this particular situation. He said, "If the position's still open," and Colton said, "It is," and that was the extent of the conversation. Perry went back to work and didn't miss a day after that. Claire Dutton felt the shift before her husband did, the way women in her position often feel the social tides before the men who created those tides can see them turning. She felt it in the quality of the silences at her gatherings, the slight reservation that entered conversations when her name was attached to something. The way certain women she'd always counted as reliable now found reasons to be elsewhere when the subject of Naomi Briggs came up. She felt it in the schoolyard, where Cray had gone from merely quiet to actually subdued, some calculus of social consequence having reached even his 9-year-old awareness. She felt it in the way Augusta Pryor, who had stepped aside at the festival ring and said then she qualifies, now nodded to Naomi in the street with the brief, complete acknowledgement of one woman recognizing another. Not warmly, not even particularly kindly, but honestly, which was the thing Augusta Pryor had always valued more than warmth. Clara brought her complaints to Gerald, but Gerald was occupied with other concerns. Matthew Ives was a thorough man, and a thorough man with good documentation has a way of making other people's situations considerably less comfortable. The boundary challenge was resolved first. The county surveyor's inability to account for the discrepancy led to an inquiry at the county land office, which led to the discovery that the filing had been submitted by a clerk who had since moved to another county. A clerk who had, it emerged, received a payment from a source adjacent to the Marsh Brothers operation shortly before the filing. The original boundary was restored. The Marsh Brothers did not attend the proceeding at which this was announced. Their attorney attended, looked at the documentation, and advised them quietly that further engagement on this matter would not serve their interests. Frank Stoller settled the billing dispute privately, before it reached a formal ruling, in the amount of $240, the original $211 plus interest as calculated by the magistrate's clerk. He did not apologize, because men like Frank Stoller rarely did, but he also did not make eye contact with Naomi Ashford in the street for a considerable period afterward, which she found a satisfactory substitute. Gerald Dutton, watching these developments with the careful attention of a man who knows when an operation has failed to achieve its objectives, made the particular decision that practical men make when the cost of continuing exceeds the value of the original goal. He withdrew. Not dramatically. There was no scene, no confrontation, no moment of acknowledged defeat. He simply stopped pressing. The Marsh Brothers were defanged. Stoller was compromised. Jim Hewitt, reading the situation with the quick practical eye of a man who had debts and needed to be on the right side of whoever was going to be in a position to help him with them, quietly reorganized his allegiances. The backroom coalition dissolved the way those coalitions always dissolve when the thing they were built around stops being profitable. Gradually, without ceremony, each man finding his own reasons to have other priorities. Clara did not dissolve. Clara Dutton was not built for dissolution. But she was built for survival, and survival sometimes required the ability to recognize a changed landscape and behave accordingly. The first sign of it came on a Wednesday afternoon in September, when Naomi was at the dry goods store collecting thread. Clara came in behind her, and for a moment the room had the held-breath quality of a space where two people have a history and everyone else knows it. Clara came to the counter. She stood beside Naomi without comment for a moment, examining a bolt of fabric with the focused attention of a woman who is looking at fabric rather than dealing with anything else that might be present. Then she said, without looking up, "The blue one will hold its color better. The green fades by the third wash." Naomi looked at her. Clara was still examining the blue fabric. Her face was composed and uninflected and gave away very little, which was a skill she had in abundance. "Thank you," Naomi said. Clara nodded once. She moved away down the counter. That was all. No apology, no acknowledgement, no moment of reckoning. Just a piece of practical information offered neutrally to a woman who needed it. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't even peace, exactly. It was the beginning of the only thing people like Clara Dutton were actually capable of offering. A kind of pragmatic coexistence. The acknowledgement that the other person was going to continue existing in the same geography, and that this required some basic level of functional civility. Naomi took it for what it was, and not for anything more, which was the right call. The courthouse in Red Hollow was not a large building. It had been built 14 years ago from the same timber as everything else on Main Street, and it smelled like old wood and whatever they used to clean the floors on Fridays, and the benches in the main room were the kind that reminded you after 20 minutes that they had not been designed with comfort in mind. Judge Avery Tolman had presided over it for 9 of those 14 years, a big-framed, deliberate man who wore his authority the way some men wore their good coats, not ostentatiously, but with the settled ease of something that fit. He had seen most things in 9 years on that bench. He said later, to his wife, in private, which was the only place he allowed himself the kind of commentary that might appear partial, that he couldn't remember a proceeding quite like the one on the 12th of October, not because of its legal complexity, which was actually fairly straightforward, but because of the quality of the room when it was happening. The adoption proceeding was first, because that was the order Matthew Ives had arranged it in, and Matthew Ives arranged things with the logic of a man who understood that sequence matters in the telling of a story. Colton sat at the petitioner's table with Ives beside him, and Naomi sat in the first row of the gallery. Not at the table, because the petition was in Colton's name as the adopting parent. And Elsie sat next to her with her hands folded in her lap and her back very straight, wearing the blue dress Naomi had made for the festival, which had been let out an inch at the hem because she'd grown since June. Judge Tolman reviewed the paperwork. He asked the questions the proceeding required: whether Colton understood the legal implications, whether the petition had been filed in accordance with the territorial statutes, whether there was any objection from any party withstanding. There was no objection. He looked at Elsie. "Young lady," he said, "do you understand what's being asked for here today?" "Yes, sir," Elsie said. "Mr. Briggs is asking to be my father, legally." "And do you agree to that?" She considered it, really considered it, with the seriousness she brought to everything, and the room waited while she did. "I agreed to it in June," she said, "at the festival. It just took a while to get the paperwork." Someone in the gallery made a sound that was almost a laugh before catching it. Judge Tolman's expression did not change, but something at the corners of it shifted toward warmth. He looked down at the documents. He signed where he needed to sign. He stamped what needed stamping. "The petition is granted," he said. "Elsie Ashford is henceforth, and for all legal purposes, Elsie Briggs, with all rights and protections attendant to that name and that family." He put down his pen. He looked at the three of them: Colton at the table, Naomi in the first row, Elsie between the two positions, belonging to both. And he said something that was outside the strict requirements of the proceeding, but that Judge Tolman apparently decided needed saying. "I've signed a lot of papers in this room," he said. "Most of them record transactions. This one records something different." He paused, choosing his words with the care of a man who doesn't say more than he means. "The law can recognize a family. It cannot create one. That work was done elsewhere, and the court is simply catching up with what already exists." He nodded at Colton. "Congratulations." The marriage proceeding was immediately after. It was brief and entirely legal, the way Colton had wanted it. Not because he was without feeling about it, but because he was a man who believed that the ceremony was not the marriage, that the marriage was the 1,000 daily decisions that preceded the ceremony and would follow it, and that dressing those decisions up in too much spectacle was a way of putting the emphasis in the wrong place. Naomi had agreed with that assessment without needing to discuss it for long. Matthew Ives witnessed. Dale Sutter, who had driven in from the ranch for the occasion and was wearing the cleanest shirt Colton had ever seen on him, witnessed. Tom Garner and his wife had come from the Eastern Lease and sat in the second row with the quiet, self-contained dignity of people who feel they are in the right place. Elsie sat in the first row and watched her mother marry Colton Briggs with an expression that was characteristically difficult to read, a complicated private look that she carried for a few minutes after the papers were signed, and then she put it away somewhere, and her face went to the ordinary present-tense expression of a child ready for whatever came next. She wore the hat to the courthouse. Not the festival hat. That was too large, though she'd refused to give it back, and it now lived on the post at the end of her bed. She wore a smaller one that Colton had found at the general store, sized for a child, dark brown with a proper crease in it. She'd put it on that morning without comment, and no one had mentioned it, and she wore it through both proceedings and out into the October afternoon sunlight, with the absolute unconcerned authority of a person who knows exactly where she belongs. The gallery in that courtroom had not been empty. This was Red Hollow, and whatever the legal proceedings of the day were, they were also a social event of some significance, and people came to social events of significance regardless of whether they'd been invited. There were perhaps 30 people in the seats by the time both proceedings were complete: townspeople, several of the outlying ranching families, a few faces Naomi didn't know and assumed were there out of general curiosity rather than any stake in the outcome. When they came out of the courthouse into the October light, there was no organized gathering, no formal reception, no arranged demonstration of community support. What there was people on the street who looked up from what they were doing and saw 3 people come out of the courthouse door, and who responded to that sight in the particular unrehearsed way of a community that has spent months watching something develop and has arrived, at different speeds and for different reasons, at its own private conclusions. Augusta Pryor was at the corner of the street with her usual companion, a woman named Helen, who had lived in Red Hollow even longer than Augusta. Augusta looked at Colton and then at Naomi, and she gave a single deliberate nod, the kind of nod that carries the full weight of a woman who does not nod at things she doesn't mean. Wilcord and Perry and two of the other ranch hands were sitting on the bench outside the feed store, which was not their usual location and which suggested they'd placed themselves there with some specific intention. When Colton came down the steps, they stood up, all of them, without being asked, and they stayed standing until the three of them had passed, and then sat back down and went back to whatever they'd been talking about, as if this were the most ordinary thing in the world. Tom Garner's wife pressed Naomi's hand briefly outside the courthouse door and said nothing, which said enough. The people who were not there, Clara Dutton, Gerald Dutton, the Marsh brothers, Frank Stoller, their absence was as deliberate and readable as anyone's presence, and it said the same thing in a different register. The accounting was done, the positions were established, and everything from here would be different from everything before. Elsie walked between her parents down the main street of Red Hollow, and she looked at the town the way she looked at most things, with the calm, direct attention of a person taking inventory. She looked at the faces that acknowledged them and the faces that looked away. She looked at the storefronts and the dust and the October sky that had gone that particular deep blue of autumn days on the high plains. She looked at the courthouse behind them and the road ahead of them. At some point during the walk to where Dale had the wagon waiting, she took Colton's hand on one side and Naomi's hand on the other, with the matter-of-fact practicality of a child who has assessed the situation and determined this to be the appropriate arrangement. She didn't make anything of it. She just held on. The Briggs Ranch and the months that followed was not a perfect place, because no place where actual people live and work is a perfect place, and anyone who tells you otherwise is selling something. There were mornings when Colton woke before light and lay in the dark with the specific weight of everything that had changed pressing on his chest in a way that was not exactly bad, but was not exactly comfortable either. The weight of two people in their history now braided with his. The weight of a child who watched everything and needed consistency from him in a way nobody had needed consistency from him in a very long time. There were evenings when the accumulated decisions of the day sat on him harder than the physical work, because managing a ranch when it was just him and Dale and the hands had been something he understood, and managing it now with the texture of a family threaded through every decision was something he was still learning. Naomi had her own version of it. She kept the shop on Main Street for 8 months after the wedding, partly because the income was practical, partly because she had not built that business to abandon it, and partly because she understood, with the clear-eyed realism that was her particular quality, that folding herself entirely into someone else's life before she was sure of the shape of her own in that life was a way of getting lost. She rode in 3 mornings a week and came back in the late afternoon, and Elsie went to school on those mornings and came to the ranch on those afternoons, and the arrangement was imperfect and inconvenient and worked better than it had any right to. She closed the shop in the spring, when it became evident that the ranch needed her fully and the shop needed someone who could give it fully, and neither of those things could be done halfway. She sold the business, the lease, and the Singer machine, and the supply inventory to a young woman from the eastern settlements who had come looking for exactly that kind of opportunity. And on the last day, she stood in the empty front room for a little while and felt the 4 years she'd spent in it with a completeness that was not grief, but was adjacent to it. 4 years of making something work on her own, of finding out what she was capable of when the options were limited and the support was non-existent. She was grateful for those years, in the complicated way of a person grateful for something that was also very hard. She locked the door and didn't look back. Elsie Briggs entered 4th grade in the autumn after her parents married, and the school year was different from every year that had preceded it, in ways both large and small. Mr. Fenn's habit of looking slightly past whoever he was speaking to now somehow included Elsie in that gaze rather than excluding her, which was a form of neutrality she found entirely acceptable. Cray Dutton was still present, still fundamentally himself, but the thing that had powered his particular cruelty, the certainty of impunity, the knowledge that adults would watch and look away, had been disrupted enough that he moved his energy to other targets, which was not ideal in terms of the world, but which was at least no longer Elsie's problem to carry. The Garner children began sitting with her at the lunch bench, first Tom's oldest, a girl named Ruth, and then gradually others. And Elsie accepted this new arrangement with the same measured caution she brought to everything she wasn't yet sure of, letting it develop at its own speed rather than trying to make it into something she needed it to be. She kept writing. Every morning that wasn't a school morning, she was at the paddock before anyone had asked her to be, and by the following spring she could do things on horseback that made Dale Sutter shake his head in the way of a man watching something that isn't quite explicable. Colton had started giving her actual work, not chores in the patronizing sense, but real ranch work that had consequences if it wasn't done properly, the kind of responsibility that tells a child they are trusted. She took it seriously the way she took everything seriously, and she made mistakes the way anyone learning makes mistakes. And she came back from those mistakes with the same even-keeled determination that was beginning to look less like stubbornness and more like character. She had Colton's hat on her bedpost and Thomas Ashford's voice in her memory, and she carried both without conflict, in the way that children can carry complicated things when the adults around them don't force them to choose. There's a thing that happens sometimes when a community watches a family build itself under pressure. It doesn't happen everywhere, and it doesn't happen quickly, and it requires the community to have at least some minimum proportion of people who are capable of looking at what they actually see rather than at what they expected to see. Red Hollow had that proportion barely. It was not a generous place, and it had not covered itself in honor during the preceding months, and many of the people who applauded at the courthouse when the proceedings were done had been conspicuously absent when the pressure was at its highest. But they applauded, and that was not nothing. There is something worth saying about what Colton Briggs did, and it is not the thing that gets said in stories like this, which is that he was a hero or a savior or a man who swept in from outside to fix something. That version of the story is easier to tell and considerably less true. What he did was notice. He noticed a child on a bench with a book she'd read 3 times, and a woman keeping her face still at the end of a long erosion, and he didn't keep walking the way he had the first time, and he never quite forgave himself for that first time, even though nobody asked him to. He was not a man without fear. He was afraid of exactly the things a man who has lost people is afraid of, which is getting involved and having it cost him, which is opening a hand that has been closed for a long time and finding out whether there's anything left in it. He did it anyway, imperfectly, and without a plan, because the alternative was continuing to be a man who crossed to the other side of the street, and he had already tried that and found it didn't fit him well. What Naomi did was harder to see and harder still to name, because it didn't happen in a public arena with an audience to witness it. It happened at a workbench at 2 a.m, in the particular silence of a person who has been managing alone long enough to have forgotten what the alternative felt like, deciding to trust something again. It happened every day she got up before light and pressed Elsie's dress and sent her out into a world that had been consistently unkind to her and said, "You're going back, not because it's fair, but because leaving is worse." It happened the moment she said stop to Clara Dutton's face in the street, knowing what it would cost her, knowing she'd have to absorb that cost alone. Naomi Ashford did not get rescued. She made a decision, carefully, with her eyes open, after examining the evidence as thoroughly as she examined a billing ledger, and she let someone in. That is not rescue. That is one of the braver things a person who has been hurt can do. And Elsie. Elsie was 8 years old, and she had already learned the things that some people spend their whole lives avoiding, that belonging is not guaranteed, that names can be taken away, that adults are capable of looking at a child's pain and laughing. She had learned those things, and they had not made her cruel, which is not inevitable, and which says something important about who was raising her. She rode a bareback horse to warn a family she barely knew because the situation required it, and she had the means, and she didn't stop to calculate whether it was her responsibility. She held Colton's hand on the walk back from the courthouse without drama or announcement, because she had already decided months ago in the paddock with Owen's nose against her shoulder that this was her family, and she was not in the habit of waiting for paperwork to confirm what she already knew. The strongest families are not always the ones that start that way. That is the thing the story of the Briggs family came to mean, not in any formal way, not in any announced or declared way, but in the way that actual meaning accumulates. through what people observed and carried with them and repeated to each other in the evenings when there was time to talk about things that mattered. In a territory where family meant blood and land and the name on a deed, three people had made a different argument. They had made it quietly, at a schoolyard gate, and a courthouse bench, and a cattle gate in front of a fire, in the particular language of people who show up and do the work and don't leave when the cost gets real. Red Hollow heard that argument eventually. Communities are slow. People are slow. The revision of an opinion held for years is not a single moment. It is a series of small adjustments, each one barely visible, until one day the thing that was true is no longer quite true and something else has taken its place. That process is not satisfying in the way that public conversions and dramatic reversals are satisfying. It is the only kind that lasts. On a Saturday morning the following May, Elsie Briggs won the county riding competition outright. Not third in the first heat and first in the second. First, full stop. Against 14 other riders, including 3 boys who had been competing for 4 years and who would have told you, before the event, that they expected to win. She rode the bay mare, who she had by now named Clover, against everyone's better advice. And she rode her the way she rode everything, with the easy, complete communication of a person who does not feel the need to prove anything to anyone because she is simply doing the thing well and the thing speaks for itself. Colton watched from the fence rail. He had the small hat in his hand. She'd given it back to him that morning to hold, on the grounds that she needed full visibility in the ring and couldn't see properly from under the brim. He turned it over in his hands throughout the competition in the habit he'd developed, the nervous fidgeting of a man watching something that mattered more to him than he entirely knew how to carry. Naomi stood beside him at the rail. She watched Elsie circle the ring on the final pass, and her face had the particular quality it sometimes got when Elsie did something that was entirely, recognizably herself. Not pride exactly, which implies surprise, but something more settled. The expression of a woman watching a thing go the way it was always going to go. When Elsie came out of the ring, she came directly to them and took the hat back from Colton and put it on her head, where it still fit imperfectly, and where she wore it with the same absolute authority she always had. "You held it crooked," she said, examining it. "I was nervous," he said. She looked at him. "I wasn't." "I know," he said. "That's why I was nervous." Something in her face did the thing it did sometimes, the thing that was not quite a smile, but occupied the same territory, the quick, private expression of a child who is more comfortable with irony than with open sentiment, who shows affection sideways because that is the shape it grew in. She handed the hat back to Naomi. "Can you fix the crease?" she asked. "He ruined it." "I can fix it," Naomi said. Elsie nodded, satisfied, and turned back to go check on Clover, because Clover had just done excellent work and deserved attention before anything else. Colton watched her go. "She's going to be something," he said. "She already is something," Naomi said. He looked at his wife. The May morning was warm and smelled of horses and new grass, and the particular aliveness of a prairie spring, and the county around them was going about its ordinary Saturday business, and standing here at a fence rail in the middle of it felt, as it had been feeling for months now, like exactly where he was supposed to be. He took her hand, the way he'd taken it on the creek bank in the smoke-colored evening, without ceremony, because he was not a man who needed ceremony for the things that mattered most. She held on. Out in the ring, Elsie Briggs talked quietly to her horse, and the horse listened, and the morning held them all without asking anything in return, which is the best a morning can do, and sometimes, for the right people at the right time, it is enough.